Hello, I'm Stephen Robinson, and welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. I am delighted to welcome documentary filmmaker Joy Davenport, who has worked in every aspect of film production for more than a decade. And thank you for joining me, Joy.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a delight to be here.
Your directorial debut was a documentary I very much enjoyed, 2022's Fannie Lou Hamer's America. And, she was a leader in the civil rights movement, for those who don't know, founder of the Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi, organizer of Freedom Summer. It's a volunteer-based campaign launched in the summer of 1964 to register as many Black voters in Mississippi as possible. Important to stress that this is all very life-threatening work. It's not sort of just kind of it was like her life was very much, and we can discuss that, but her life was very much in danger constantly for her work. What drew you specifically to to tell her story, especially as your first documentary?
So this was a very long-term project. Really, the research for it started when I was in undergrad and then later continued in my master's program. And so the seed was initially planted when I learned about the MFDP, because it was this grassroots organization, and I was like very idealistic about politics at the time, and I'd never heard of it. It seemed so transformative and so unique, but I was growing up in Florida, going to public schools, I was never taught about that history. I knew nothing about any of these figureheads that I was learning about that were so pivotal. And Mrs. Hamer specifically, she emphasized the need for integration across several lines of identity. That it was important that if a white person wanted to join her cause, that they should. If a rich person wanted to join her cause, or if a rabbi or a preacher or just anybody, come along, because you needed everybody. And I took that as an invitation, because I was already really upset that this information had been kind of hidden from me. And so I just went all in on learning about the MFDP and SNCC and CORE and COFO and the alphabet soup of organizations that kind of rose up against the iceberg of Mississippi's political climate. And then in my master's, I did my thesis on the MFDP, and I met Monica Land, who's the grandniece of Mrs. Hamer and who's the executive producer for the project. And she asked me to join up as the editor. And then I ended up becoming the director. And this is 14 years of history, but it started in college when I was learning that there was this history that had basically been denied to me. And I wanted to know more.
And you sort of answered or touched upon my follow-up question on this, because with your own experience, because about a year ago, I wrote a piece during the Republican primary, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, when addressing a Trump rally, I believe in New Hampshire, he had directly quoted Hamer, her line about "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired," and I, of course, found that incredibly appalling, and I wrote a pretty angry. People will judge whether whether that's unusual for me or not, but I thought it was fairly unusually angry. But Tim Scott is a Black person from South Carolina, much like myself, knew what he was saying. I remember my father being very upset and responding in response to this, having sort of lived through that period. And something that had occurred as sort of a theme when I wrote that, and it's happened, I've written about other incidents in history, how so many well-educated people of all races, but particularly white folks who've gotten master degrees, all sorts of what would you consider the appropriate, proper education, had no idea who this woman was and what she had done. And I was going to ask if that was your experience of making a documentary, but you had sort of said that it was your personal experience as well of not fully knowing who she was and the role she played in American history. Just what are your thoughts on that? How that when you first started to discover who she was and that this had been and what she had done.
Well, first of all, I love that piece.
No,
I love that
you.
piece, and I was pumping my fist along with it. You were right, and you were right to say it, and I'm glad you did. And something that has occurred to me a lot as I've worked on this piece, one of the reasons that I think her history has been, I think, deliberately suppressed is because of how difficult it is to whitewash. And so Senator Scott was trying it. He was trying to do the content of our character thing, where everybody only knows one MLK quote. And so people know Fannie Lou's quote, and they say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And it's distasteful, but she resists, like her history resists that whitewashing because of how radical she was and how outspoken she was. And it's very difficult, aside from like that one phrase, really, to pick something that you can appropriate for bad faith causes. And I think because she was a woman and she was middle-aged when she got started in the movement, and because she didn't have a formal education, even the people that she worked with had trouble figuring out how to categorize her. She didn't get the recognition, and it's very difficult to use her for your own purposes. Her voice is so unique to her, and her testimony is so unique to her life that it's hard to twist. I feel like I might have wandered off of your question.
No. It is the kind of, and she exists in modern history. I do think, and I've touched upon this when talking about some challenges the Democratic Party has had of folks, who remember that period and their relationship with the Democratic Party through the civil rights movement, slowly sort of moving on, passing on. But it is amazing to me because it feels so modern. As people who do media as well, I think of some movies or album, I'm listening to a Beatles album from that period and this is going on. So it doesn't feel like ancient history, but she did not live in, it was America, but it wasn't America. The context of her freedom and enfranchisement was sort of academic, if you could go into that. Like her idea of being a free person in the world was sort of academic.
Yeah, well, there's also, she was savvy about the media as well, and so sometimes when she would say that she didn't know that she could vote, it like she knew technically that these things were happening and that it was possible for people to do these things, and also that it was impractical to try. And
absolutely.
She knew people who were involved in the NAACP in the 50s and they were murdered. So she worked with her community and just assumed voting is white people stuff, which was the common attitude for most of the Black population in Mississippi at the time, out of the need for survival. Because if you tried to register to vote, even worse, if you tried to encourage other people to register to vote, you would just be assassinated in broad daylight. And there's so many cases where that happened. So it was an academic thing to her. It was just like, well, that's over there, and like other people can do it if they want, but it's got nothing to do with me. And it wasn't until the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came in to Ruleville and had a mass meeting at her church that she decided, like, well, I can do this. These are young folks. They've got training in things that I don't have training in, but I know how things work in Mississippi. And so she volunteered to be one of the two people to try and register, and was a part of that first wave of registration attempts in 62, 63. And so it became clear to her and to the people around her that none of it was academic, that it was like that these rights are intellectually granted, like that they're granted, but then the grit, the like people power on the ground that was required to make it happen, that's what was going to do it. And that the outside groups didn't know what was going on in Mississippi. They needed her as much as she needed them, and that was the core of what became the MFDP.
And you're talking about, again, being assassinated, physical violence. She was viciously beaten at one point. Could you go into that a bit for folks to know the sort of just it again, not academic, really was
very lived. Yeah. She had gone to a voter registration workshop with SNCC to learn to get other folks registered. And on the way back from that, I think the registration workshop was in Nashville, and they were coming back and they passed through Winona, Mississippi, and they stopped at the bus terminal to use the bathroom, go to the cafe diner, and some folks got the attention of the police there, and they started to round them up. And somebody told Mrs. Hamer, like, don't get off the bus because the cops are here. And one of the cops recognized her because she was a local person who was active. And so, said, grab her too. They took her to the jail in Winona, and they beat her, and they beat several other people. Yvester Simpson. They beat the second wave of people that came to bail them out. They jailed them too and beat them. So it was entirely a lawless state. But she suffered kidney injuries. She was partially blind in one eye. She had a blood clot. She carried those injuries for the rest of her life, and that was something that she knew could happen and would happen, and was happening to everybody around her. And it was kind of like it affected her deeply, but it was also par for the course. And she said after that if she had been a man, if she'd been her husband doing that, they would have just killed her. And in fact, when she was in jail, Medgar Evers was shot and killed. That was the same weekend. So,
Mhm.
she knew what was going on, and she took those beatings knowing that that was probably what was going to happen to her, and then she kept on afterward too.
And, talking to you after the most recent election, and often when we talked about sort of the whitewashing of history, there was a sense of, from just an historical truth, it's important to tell these stories, but something I sort of found over the past couple years, I don't know if you have as well, of like, is this perpetuating cycle, because if people don't know this history, it's very hard. You get the chicken littleness of like, oh no, no, fascism will come and terrible things will happen. And it's like, what are you talking about? Famously people saying like, you think it's going to be like 1984 or the Handmaid's Tale, like all things that are dystopian but fictional, as opposed to no stuff when my father was alive, my parents were alive, this was what existed and could happen again. But it becomes very hard without that knowledge, right?
Yeah, I mean, she was living under fascism. She was living under an ethno state where she and everybody around her were beaten into submission and killed if the beating didn't take. And so the world that she was describing, that's why the film is called Fannie Hamer's America, because she's not describing Mississippi in 1963. She's describing America now. And our lineage is one of being an authoritarian ethno state where the things are made to prop up white supremacy. And so she knew this, and that's what was dangerous and effective about her testimony, was that you can't ignore it. She's saying it, and it's her life, and it happened to her, and she's got the bruises to prove it. And that's also why she had to be suppressed after the fact, because it wasn't this happy story. And the MFDP was not formed in opposition to the Republican Party. The MFDP was formed in opposition to the Democratic Party, and it was the Republican Party that voted in any success that they had at the state or national level, because they knew it would be sticking it to the Democrats. And because some in the Republican Party at that time were not the same Republicans we have now. They believed more in like small government and individual liberties, and they took that seriously enough to allow Mrs. Hamer to come to the floor of Congress. But the MFDP existed as a vehicle to protest the Democratic Party, which I think people forget that, and I think that's a thing we need now. It's a unpopular thing to say, but the Democrats being so corporatist as they are, and not liking people who rock the boat, the same thing that she met at Atlantic City in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson cut her off in the middle of her nationally broadcast testimony, because it was the Democrats that looked bad. And they didn't want to look bad. And that need to like save face and not look bad and continue this rosy picture of America is exactly why the Democrats keep painting themselves into corners like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, once again, in my own experience, I think some of the response to the election has been, why are you focusing on what Democrats did wrong or could have done right, or did things like, why aren't you focusing on the Republicans? And it's like, well, sure, I do as well, but to a certain point, it's like they are the asteroid. They are the iceberg, and I'm trying to reach the functional people. Let's steer away from the, let's not accelerate toward the other, let's steer away. And if you don't have those conversations, you're just going to, get wiped out. And I feel like that's what we're sort of seeing now, I think. And I think that, Otis, if you don't mind my steering into this, because I seen an interview with you where you were talking about, in future work, like focusing on your own sort of place in the world, in the country. And I know after this election, part of the agenda has been to target queer people, particularly trans people, kind of a political spin on what they said about the Holocaust, right? Which was like, if you could, that's about how 30% of the population can kill the other 30% if 30% watches. Except here, it's like we're talking about 1 or 2%. And what happens again with the Democratic Party is like, okay, well, maybe we will watch, right? Because it's 2% of the population. Is it worth the risk to us? Is that some, yeah, and a lot of people have different views of this. I'm just curious as to yours after the election, how you feel as a queer person in America right now.
Yeah, it's really disorienting to watch people who I believe are of good faith, people who I've looked up to, kind of wringing their hands over like the trans problem, and like and I've had people, good friends of mine, state to me kind of bluntly that it was trans people that cost the Democrats the election. And it's such a bizarro world view of things, because I don't recall any Democrats that I personally look up to standing up for me. It was, mostly the people screaming about identity politics or the Republicans and their bad faith attacks. And I transitioned halfway through the production of this film, and the biggest reason I did is because I was deep in the research and reading about all this stuff that Mrs. Hamer went through by putting herself out there, and there was nowhere for her to hide. She could not hide who she was. That's why she got arrested in Winona. She hadn't done anything wrong. She just was recognizable, and so they thought they'd make an example out of her. And just reading and living this story for so many years, I just felt shame that I didn't have the same courage to, like, especially because when I transitioned was 2017, 2018, in that like kind of a small window that people called the trans tipping point, where it was acceptable. And I was like, there's never going to be a time that I feel that I feel more comfortable doing this, or more backed up by my own principles. And so I did it. And then I watched things change, and trans people become the hot button target, for so many politics in this country. I don't regret doing it, but it's a very scary time, because when I speak out about my own stories, I'm accused of being biased. I'm told that I can't tell my own stories because I have an interest in this somehow. And it's like, well, why not? Like, that's the power of Mrs. Hamer's voice. She's telling her story. Her testimony can't be denied because she lived it. But you see at kind of the mainstream publications, or in the discourse with the capital D, they're always talking about us, but we're never the voice. Like, always the subject, but never the speaker. And I don't know what the project that I'm going to do will be. And I don't want it to be purely a reactionary project, but I do think that in the same way that I was inspired by hearing Mrs. Hamer just speak her testimony, I think we need to be able to create spaces for trans and gender exuberant and queer people to state their testimony in a place where their voice can be heard.
Absolutely. And I think you're sort of a great example of this, because I feel like the biggest challenge when I look at election, again, it's my own background in the arts, it's sort of about storytelling. And I feel like not telling a great story or not marketing a great story is sometimes why things fail. And I think sometimes it's sort of like, because we didn't tell the story well, or we didn't market it well, no one wants to hear the story. If you look at the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was specifically good about narratives and stories and, building empathy. You have to believe that people have empathy, you can reach them. And so what I found interesting was the sense of that trans people cost the election. I was sort of screaming for most of last year. It's like, well, you can't let these attacks go unanswered. I think there was a sense of just ignore it, and it's all a distraction from, real policies. And it's like, well, no, I think there are people who feel like, wait a minute, like they're taking our tax dollars and giving free, or they're going to change my child's gender when they go to school, and stuff that seems absurd, but for someone of good faith might legitimately believe crazy stuff unless you are. I mean, that's the power of propaganda. So you have to challenge it. And I think that's where, you talk about your story and talking about being non-objective, that makes it more compelling, right? Because it's like, here's who I am as a person. And I feel like there are certain people who you're not going to reach, right? But I think there are a lot of people who like get the sense of, oh, that I did not know that, and it does make a difference. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right on target, and I think people want to see. I think one of the things people come to the Democratic Party for is to stand up to bullies, and this was just a massive, well-funded bullying campaign that they essentially left the field open for. It feels like the messaging was so hamstrung by not knowing how to talk about trans issues, and the answer feels so simple to me. It's like, just put a trans person, let us speak. and then back us up. And I think that even when I talk to my friends who are centrists or even Republicans, they'll talk about how, oh, the people back home, they'd love you. And I'd say, like, how can you say that? I've just watched what's happened on a national scale. And they say, well, no, like, as a person, they'll love you. And that's the disconnect, is there's this like big messaging war, and we're at best 1% of the population, which makes it a very safe target for harassment, because nobody knows a trans person. Or obviously, like, there are people who do, but if you look at the 99% of people who aren't trans, it's unlikely that every one of them is going to know someone or reach out to someone, or that a trans person will feel safe speaking to someone in this environment. So it's just this cowardice of not wanting to get it wrong, or not wanting. I think there's also a kind of built-in shame of, there are people who think that trans folks are icky, and so they don't want to talk about it. And I just think it's a very easy solution. It was just like, put one of us in. Like, we know how to talk about our experience. We would love to talk about our experience. And if that could be put out in a reasonable way with the backup of the institutions, then that would just neuter the attack, because nobody's going and getting free transitions at school. I mean, I wish, like, that, what a dream. But this is, it's fully fabricated, and there's nobody pushing back on it.
And it was strange, because it felt like they had this argument about Republicans are weird, and then they sort of backed away from it, which was to say, because perhaps they, as you said, they felt that, oh, well, maybe queer people are weird and we can't defend this. And it's like, it's very easy to do, because you need to actually put people out there, of all types as well, because people are going to, like, if it's all people from urban cities, or big, same with Black people as well, if they who do you know? If you're a Black person in rural America, who do you know? You probably do know someone who has very similar experiences to you, who is also trans, and so you show that person whatever. But I feel like there's so much opportunity for getting that humanity out there of what this experience is, that I look forward to how you approach that and how you do that, because it's going to be very important storytelling.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too, and I'm also kind of afraid of it, because my discipline I started as being a historian and a rhetorician before I pivoted into making documentaries, and so I'm a little allergic to having the focus on me. I as an ethical matter, I've always felt like it's important to create space as a film, like, for the film or the subject, whatever the subject is, and by doing so, remove myself as much as possible from that space. So to occupy that space myself, or to put my interests of my community first, I do worry about, what does this mean as far as bias? Can I get this right? But I take the lesson of Mrs. Hamer that, like, if you speak the truth, you have nothing to fear. And that's something that people, I think there's a hunger for sincere truth telling in this country. And when I talk to folks, I've been in Mississippi as a trans woman. I've been in Texas, Florida as a trans woman. I mean, I'm like an internally displaced refugee, because I lived in Florida and I can't now. I live in Chicago now, because Florida is just too hostile to live there anymore. But when I'm talking to folks, just people, they get along just fine. So it's doing a disservice to the people who are buying the propaganda as well. And it's doing a disservice to the families of trans people too, because I think there's always this assumption, like, well, trans people don't have families because their families all disown them. But that's not true. Like, my mom gets so upset. She's a conservative Christian. My family's lifelong Republicans, and they get so mad because they're like, well, don't they know that, like, trans daughters are also daughters? Don't they know that, like, my child is my child? Don't they know that, like, trans people have families, and those families are hurting now too? So I just think the more we can make it clear that we're not just all alone. We're not an easy target. We are connected. We're normal. We're boring. Like, I really, that's the thing I keep coming back to when I imagine what I would like. This is counterintuitive because of, like, the need for exhilarating content, but I want to make something really boring about trans people, just to show, like, we brush our teeth and we struggle with the bills and we clean the litter box, and that's,
Yeah,
we're folks.
Absolutely. I know in the theater community, there's been a push to do that more with all groups. So trans people and people who live with disabilities, or anyone who's different, because what often happens is, you see it, I've seen it, like, a woman in a wheelchair comes in, or someone who's trans comes on, and the audience like, oh, this is going to be. It's like someone wearing a superhero costume. Oh, I guess this is the movie we're seeing, right? And it's like, well,
Right.
no, that's just the judge. That's the second. Like this is still a normal rom-com. It's
Yeah, this isn't like a very special after school episode where we're going to address some social issue. Like, we're just a person.
yeah, trans people exist in the world, and they have meet the parents situations. They have all these sort of situations just like anyone else, and that's more of like trying to um I think it always bugged me when people would say that they couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. One, because Blazing Saddles is very quote unquote woke for the period, but now it would clearly be the trans sheriff who is coming in and who is like, I've already sort of fan cast at it with Jinx Monsoon of
Oh
like,
my God. I would love that. I want to see that happen.
Yes, because that's the story Mel Brooks was telling in 1974. Because this is only a decade after what Hammer is experiencing. A decade later, Mel Gibson is saying anyone who's racist is an idiot or a crook, is a terrible person, or moron is the famous quote from Gene Wilder. So he's like really laying it out there. So, I mean, there's all opportunities to sort of address this sort of what we're seeing now, though. But you've mentioned for your own safety, obviously you've left, which is unfortunate, and kind of I think there's a lot of smaller great migrations happening, unfortunately, with people leaving these states, which benefits Republicans because that's another, as they would say, liberal voice leaving, liberal vote leaving. But also, your quote unquote blue states are often, especially in cities, far more expensive for people to live, and that is, do you have any idea about that, of what it's like for folks who are having to kind of go? Because I've seen people like, why don't you just leave these cities or states? It's like, but
that's such a hellish thing to suggest. Like, what a dick thing to suggest to somebody. Because, like, have you ever had to leave your home for good? Have you ever had to like leave behind everything that you know and value without knowing if you'll ever be able to return? That's a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
Like, I have a partner in Florida. I have a cat who I left behind who passed away because I wasn't able to get back. My family is in Florida. Everything I love is in Florida.
Yeah.
It's so, and not everyone has the opportunity. Like, I'm the lucky one, I think. Like, I had the privilege and the resources to relocate, and not everyone does that. So when you think about this like red state, blue state thing, there's lots of trans folks in Florida, in Texas, in Missouri, and a lot of them can't or don't want to leave, and they deserve support too. They are struggling too, and the expense of living in a blue state is usually just non-negotiable for folks that are just working retail in Arkansas. And so there's the practical aspect of it, of not everyone even can do it, and that's a tragedy. But there's also the, like, I would like to go home. I really would. Like, I was trying to set up a life there, but that was foreclosed. And so anybody who says like, why don't you just move? I wonder how they would feel if their identity category next month ends up being unwelcome and they have to pick up and move. Like, when it comes to your door, I think you'll feel differently.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I was also very frustrated by that when I would see that sentiment. I'm from the South. The South is my home as well. My own family is there. And myself and my family, we have a right to be there, similar to you. I would see the sentiment from people who would recognize how, let's say, Palestinians have a right to live where they know, where their home. And they would never say, like, well, what are you doing there? Like, just move, like, go.
Yeah.
Go to
Syria.
Like,
No.
that's a weird thing to suggest, but they would have no problem suggesting that you or any other queer person leave the only home you've known. And I think perhaps it's obviously an American bias from the left about certain parts of the country, which I think is unfortunate. I think we need more people who aren't at risk from some of these regimes to move to those states until we change the Senate structure or the Electoral College. The only way to sort of compete is that we need to move, Wyoming's lovely. More people go to Wyoming, Get just
Yeah.
more people, Wyoming, flip that blue, and get 2 more senators and everything, like, stuff like that. I think can help. And I only mean that slightly joking, because it does seem like not to sound hopeless, but it seems like we are fleeing, right? It seems like we're having to, and I don't judge this. I know why. I mean, it's very tough to live someplace where the rest of your life can be not a pleasant prospect.
Yeah. Well, and I also feel guilt about leaving because of one, that there are folks who can't. And if you leave them behind, then that's one less person to join them in solidarity. And also because there's a clip in the Fannie Lou Hamer movie of Mrs. Hamer telling a young person, like, don't move to Chicago, stay in Mississippi and make it right here. And like, well, I'm living in Chicago now. I left my home in the South and I moved to Chicago. So there's no easy answer. But I do think, because of what a small and vulnerable population trans and queer folks are, that we need the other folks to step up for us. We really do. We need, like, in the same way that there were white allies in Mrs. Hamer's life from all walks of life, as well as her own Black community. We need straight and cis people to put themselves out there and help us make space to be safe as well.
Yeah, and often I think we see people who frame this as, well, things are bad now, but for the arc of history, justice comes, and it just seems very, well, but my life is a very small part of that arc. Like, so if you're telling, I mean, I have friends who their daughters, started college when Roe was overturned. And, if you're telling them, it's like, okay, well, maybe the Supreme Court will have a liberal majority by the time this person is 50, is not, to an 18-year-old, you're like, what the hell? You might, my life. And if you're queer, it's like 30, 40 years. It's like, that's, and especially when you talk about it in the frame of history will judge or history will record. I'm like, what are you talking about? Donald Trump is going to have an airport named after him. Like,
Exactly.
I remember, Black people I grew up with, to slave catcher high school. Like, that's a thing. So I was always mind boggled by that. You're from Florida as well, like the history of a lot of these places and whatever. So the idea that, like, history came and judged these people.
Yeah,
Like,
the moral arc of the universe doesn't bend itself towards justice. Like, that's us. We have to do that. Like, it's such a passive way of looking at history as, like, separate from us, but we're living it. We're in it. Like, it is made of us. And whatever we do now is history. And whatever was done before us is still happening. The movement that Mrs. Hamer fought to build is now. Everything that she fought against is back. The Citizens Council just went national. Like, we are living in the failure of people to take that moral arc seriously and bend it themselves. Because I don't think that Mrs. Hamer would agree that it's fine to just, like, let history judge. She said specifically, like, I don't want you to tell me that you're behind me. I want you to tell me that you are with me, and we're going to walk down the freedom road together. That's what history is you make it. And if you just sit back and let history roll over you, then you are the grand mass of people that let the tragedy happen. Like, stand up and make history your own, because otherwise history is gonna roll you.
So where can people who haven't seen this documentary, and they should see your documentary about Miss Hamer, where can they view it? I think,
so it
still
is
on PBS?
It's I don't know when this airs. There's no air. It's online. It's a series of tubes. But it's airing on PBS again tonight, the 16th. Check your local listings. It frequently shows up still on rebroadcast, but it's streaming for free on YouTube on the World Channel YouTube page until the end of February. So there's a free stream. The full movie is available on YouTube, and you can also, after February, find it on any of the streaming platforms: Apple, Amazon, Pubu, whatever the thing is that you're doing, it's there for the most part.
And where can people connect with you and learn more about what your next project will be and so forth?
So I recently started a Blue Sky account, like a lot of folks. That's where you found me. So you can find me on Blue Sky under my name, Joy Davenport. I have a personal website, Joy Elaine Davenport, where I just keep my portfolio. and who knows what comes next, because the whenever I get the question of like, where do we find you, and then a year later that platform is gone. So find me in the wind, I guess, but I'm going to be out there, and for the moment it's on blue sky.
We're in Chicago now, so I hope that is not too drastic a physical climate shift from someone who's from Florida, but
I
perhaps
love it in Chicago.
yeah.
Actually, I like the cold much better than the heat.
Oh,
Snow,
great.
because I'm like a Southern gal. Snow is magical still. Like it's maybe give me a few years and I'll be really sick of it. But at the moment, I love it. I love looking out the window and seeing the snow. So long as I don't have to go out in it, which is actually what I'm about to do as soon as we're done talking. So this was a good time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Joy. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you, folks. Check out Joy Davenport on the series of tubes, for those of us who remember that reference. And we'll catch you next time. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you.